Late 1944. The first warning does not come from the horizon, but from light pulsing on radar screens deep inside steel hulls. Operators expect formations, the familiar clutter of massed aircraft. Instead, they see single returns, isolated points, moving with steady purpose. Each contact descends directly, cleanly, without deviation. There is no search pattern, no hesitation, only intent. As the aircraft close, visual confirmation follows. Pilots can be seen in their cockpits, aligned perfectly with their targets. They do not weave to confuse aim. They do not climb or jink under fire. They do not react as men who expect to live beyond the next few minutes. Their flight paths are straight lines drawn from sky to ship, from decision to consequence. This is not an attack on airspace. It is an attack on certainty. Japanese pilots are no longer testing defenses or probing for weakness. They are aiming at ships themselves, at decks, bridges, ammunition stores. The assumption that an enemy wishes to survive the approach collapses in real time. Interception windows shrink to nothing. The future no longer contains a breakaway. Anti-aircraft crews respond as doctrine demands. Guns elevate. Fire control systems calculate lead angles based on speed and distance. Shells burst along predicted paths. But prediction depends on fear, on the expectation that an aircraft will turn away when danger becomes overwhelming. These aircraft do not. Tracers pass close. Flak fills the sky. Still, the attackers continue. On deck, the sensation changes. This no longer feels like combat. It feels like waiting. Sailors brace not for near misses, but for collision. Defensive fire feels slow, almost ceremonial as the distance collapses. Near misses mean nothing. A shell that fails to strike directly has failed completely. The aircraft grows larger, louder, certain. Then, something happens that does not fit the pattern. Explosions appear where nothing was hit. Bursts of fire bloom in open air. Aircraft shudder violently. Wings shear away mid-dive. Control surfaces vanish in an instant. Some planes simply disintegrate, their remains scattering into the sea instead of slamming into steel. For the first time, impact is no longer inevitable. And though no one can yet explain why, the sky itself has begun to change sides. By late 1944, the logic behind the attacks became unmistakable. Kamikaze doctrine removed fear of death entirely, not as a byproduct, but as a prerequisite. These pilots were not trained to return. They were trained to arrive. Survival was no longer a variable to be managed. It was an obstacle eliminated before takeoff. With that removal, something else disappeared as well. The hesitation that had shaped air combat since its beginning. In conventional attacks, pilots measured danger constantly. They broke away when fire thickened. They climbed to preserve the aircraft. They disengaged when damage threatened control. Kamikaze pilots did none of this. Once aligned, they held course. No evasive maneuver interrupted the dive. No instinct overruled the mission. The aircraft became a guided projectile whose final correction was made by human resolve. Paradoxically, this made the attack more accurate. Without the need to survive, pilots no longer compromised their approach. They did not jink under fire or widen turns to preserve altitude. Every adjustment served only one purpose: impact. The result was a level of precision that mechanical guidance had not yet achieved. Ships were no longer threatened statistically. They were selected individually. Aboard Allied vessels, the psychological shift was immediate. Crews no longer braced for combat in the abstract. They braced for collision. The familiar rhythms of air defense spot, track, engage, repel collapsed into a single question. Would the aircraft reach the hull? Defensive fire felt slow, almost archaic, its calculations built for enemies who still feared proximity. When hits occurred, they were devastating. Fuel, engine mass, and explosive payload arrived together, converting aircraft into kinetic warheads. Fires spread rapidly. Structural damage followed predictable lines of destruction. Even when ships survived, they did so scarred, wounded, and shaken. Each successful strike reinforced the belief that this tactic worked not because it was efficient, but because it was absolute. For a brief moment, the balance shifted. Courage appeared to overpower technology. Commitment seemed to defeat calculation. The attacker held the advantage, not through numbers or innovation, but through certainty. But certainty invites countermeasures. And even as ships absorbed the shock of these attacks, a quieter question began to surface: what happens when commitment becomes predictable and predictability becomes exploitable? For decades, naval air defense had been built on timing. Anti-aircraft shells were designed to explode at a calculated moment, their fuses set by hand or machine to detonate at a predicted altitude. Success depended on precision, layered upon precision. Accurate range estimation, correct speed assessment, flawless coordination between radar, fire control, and human judgment. When everything aligned, the sky could be made lethal. When it did not, shells passed harmlessly through empty air. Human reaction time sat at the center of this system. Gunners tracked targets, relayed data, and adjusted aim while aircraft closed the distance at hundreds of miles per hour. Against conventional attackers, this margin was sufficient. Pilots turned away, climbed, or released ordnance early. Each maneuver bought defenders time. Each deviation increased the chance of a miscalculation by the attacker. Kamikaze attacks removed that margin entirely. High-speed dives compressed engagement windows to seconds. There was no climb, no release point, no withdrawal. The aircraft remained on a constant vector, reducing the defense's opportunity to correct errors. Timed fuses, once reliable, became liabilities. A shell that burst too early wasted its fragments. One that burst too late might never detonate at all. Near misses meant nothing. Fragmentation patterns assumed proximity, but proximity without detonation produced no effect. Unless a shell struck the aircraft directly or detonated at precisely the right instant the attack continued, defense doctrine demanded perfection under impossible conditions. Every engagement became a test of ideal circumstances that rarely existed. Kamikaze pilots exploited this brutally, though often unknowingly. Their unwavering dives transformed defensive fire into a mathematical exercise with no room for tolerance. Even dense barrages could fail if timing slipped by fractions of a second. The sky filled with explosions that harmed nothing, while aircraft slipped through the gaps unchanged. To those on deck, the realization was unsettling. Guns still fired, shells still burst, yet the results no longer matched the effort. Systems that had worked for years suddenly felt obsolete. Not gradually. Overnight. The defense had not been outnumbered. It had been outpaced by a change in assumptions. And somewhere within that failure lay the outline of a solution. One that no longer asked humans to predict the exact moment of destruction. By the final year of the war, Japan was no longer competing on equal industrial terms. Shipyards lay damaged, aircraft production slowed, fuel stocks thinned. Every replacement took longer to build, longer to train, longer to deliver. The arithmetic of modern war had turned against the empire, and no amount of courage could reverse the imbalance of steel, oil, and time. What remained was not capacity, but will. In that narrowing space, pilots were redefined. No longer assets to be preserved, they became components, expendable elements in a larger calculation. Aircraft were stripped of return requirements. Landing gear was removed. Fuel loads were calculated for one-way travel. The pilot was no longer expected to manage risk, only to eliminate distance. Precision, not survivability, became the governing metric. This shift altered training at its core. Flight hours were shortened. Advanced tactics were abandoned. Formation, discipline, and defensive maneuver were rendered irrelevant. What replaced them was commitment, absolute, unquestioned, and final. Pilots were taught to fly straight, hold course, and ignore everything except the target ahead. Skill was compressed into intention. Complexity was reduced to certainty. The tactic relied entirely on impact. Every assumption built into the doctrine rested on the belief that the aircraft would reach the ship. There was no margin for partial success, no secondary objective. Either the plane struck home, or the mission failed completely. This binary logic simplified planning and decision-making, but it also removed adaptability. Once launched, the attack could not evolve. Japanese planners understood the cost. Losses would be extreme. Entire units would vanish in a single afternoon. But they believed something else would fill the gap left by material inferiority. Psychological shock. The sight of pilots willingly dying was expected to erode Allied morale, to strain crews already stretched thin, to force hesitation where none had existed. Fear, it was hoped, would substitute for firepower. In this reasoning lay both clarity and arrogance. The enemy was assumed to be human first, technical second. Resolve was believed to be contagious, terror transferable. The possibility that technology might neutralize sacrifice, that machines might absorb intent without reaction, was underestimated. Death was weaponized deliberately, but the weapon assumed the battlefield would remain unchanged. For the pilots themselves, the logic was presented as inevitability. Departure ceremonies replaced briefings, farewells replaced contingency plans. Individual lives were folded into a narrative of national survival, where doubt became indistinguishable from betrayal. The aircraft carried not just explosives, but expectation. Yet this final logic depended on a single fragile constant. That certainty of impact could not be denied. And even as the doctrine hardened into belief, unseen forces were already working to break that certainty apart, quietly, mathematically, without regard for intention. Across the Pacific, Allied commanders faced the kamikaze threat with confidence rooted in experience. Their fleets were the most heavily defended assemblages of ships ever put to sea. Layers of protection surrounded every carrier and transport radar pickets, fighter patrols, overlapping fields of anti-aircraft fire. This system had been built to absorb pressure, to blunt mass attacks through depth rather than finesse. It had worked before. There was no immediate reason to believe it would fail now. At the heart of this confidence was volume. Thousands of guns, firing tens of thousands of rounds, were expected to compensate for any individual imperfection. Accuracy mattered, but density mattered more. The doctrine assumed that if enough steel filled the air, no aircraft could pass through unscathed. Precision was desirable, but saturation was decisive. The sky itself would become a barrier. This logic rested on an older assumption that attackers would behave like attackers always had. Existing anti-aircraft doctrine was optimized for enemies who valued survival. Fire control systems predicted turns, climbs, and breakaways. Lead angles were calculated on the expectation of evasion. The mathematics of defense assumed fear as a constant, a variable that shaped every approach. Early kamikaze encounters did little to challenge this belief. Some attacks failed outright. Others caused damage without sinking ships. Crews adapted informally, adding more guns, firing earlier, tightening formations. Losses were logged, repairs made. Each ship that remained afloat reinforced the idea that the system was holding. The attacks were brutal, but they appeared unsustainable. No air force, it was assumed, could endure such losses for long. Damage reports told a reassuring story. Ships burned, but they survived. Hulls were breached, but compartments held. The fleet continued to move, to launch aircraft, to advance. From a strategic distance, the kamikaze threat looked costly, but contained a weapon of desperation rather than transformation. Courage, it seemed, was being spent faster than it could be replaced. What this perspective missed was subtle but critical. Survivability was not the same as security. Each successful impact carried disproportionate risk. Each aircraft that slipped through represented a failure that statistics alone could not neutralize. The system was absorbing damage, but it was not preventing it. And prevention, not endurance, was what modern naval warfare demanded. The danger was underestimated not because commanders were careless, but because their assumptions were inherited. They trusted the logic that had won earlier battles. They trusted numbers. They trusted that scale would smooth out anomalies. But kamikaze attacks were not anomalies. They were signals, evidence that the rules governing attack and defense had shifted. The fleets believed they could outlast the threat. They did not yet realize that endurance was no longer the measure. Somewhere within the Allied system, a quieter solution was forming, one that would not rely on more guns or more shells, but on changing when and how destruction was allowed to occur. Long before the kamikaze threat reached its peak, a quieter effort had been unfolding far from the front lines. In laboratories and workshops, Allied engineers wrestled with a problem that gunnery tradition had never fully solved: human reaction time. No matter how disciplined the crew or advanced the fire control system, a person still had to judge distance, predict motion, and choose the moment of destruction. Against faster aircraft, that margin was shrinking towards zero. The idea was deceptively simple. Instead of asking gunners to decide when a shell should explode, let the shell decide for itself. Engineers pursued a fuse that could react faster than any human calculation, a mechanism that sensed proximity rather than waiting for impact or a preset timer. If the shell could recognize when it was close enough to its target, precision aim would no longer be required. This represented a fundamental shift in logic. Timed fuses demanded prediction. Altitude, speed, and course all had to be estimated in advance. Proximity fuses replaced prediction with measurement. Radio waves emitted from the shell bounced off nearby objects. When the reflected signal crossed a threshold, detonation occurred automatically. Mathematics replaced timing. Probability replaced judgment. The implications were profound. Explosions no longer depended on direct hits or perfect bursts. A shell that passed near an aircraft could still be lethal. Fragmentation patterns expanded into space the aircraft intended to occupy, not space it had already passed. The sky itself became part of the weapon, filled with invisible decision-making occurring at the speed of light. To those trained in traditional gunnery, the concept felt almost heretical. For centuries, effectiveness had been tied to accuracy, hit the target, or fail. This new approach accepted imprecision and made it deadly. The gunner aimed into a volume rather than a point. Success was measured not by marksmanship, but by denial of space. The shell, once a passive object, became an active participant. It no longer waited for command after leaving the barrel. It carried its own logic, its own threshold for action. In flight, nothing about it appeared different. There was no visible cue, no altered trajectory. The solution was entirely invisible, revealed only at the moment of destruction. This invisibility was its greatest strength. Enemy pilots could not adapt to what they could not see. There was no maneuver to counter a detonation that required neither contact nor warning. The fuse reacted faster than fear, faster than reflex, faster than courage could compensate for. Yet even as prototypes proved successful, confidence remained uneven. The system contradicted generations of experience. It placed trust not in the gunner's skill, but in circuitry sealed inside a shell. To some, it felt like surrendering control at the very moment control seemed most necessary. What few yet grasped was that this surrender was precisely the point. By removing the human equation at the final instant, the weapon did not weaken defense, it freed it. And once released into combat, this idea would not merely counter the kamikaze threat. It would redefine what it meant to defend the sky. The first engagements did not announce themselves as breakthroughs. They unfolded like ordinary attacks, indistinguishable at the outset from the many that had come before. Kamikaze aircraft appeared on radar, detached from formations, descending with the same unwavering resolve. Pilots entered defensive airspace confidently, holding straight lines through dense flak zones that had failed to stop others. From their perspective, nothing had changed. The ship still lay ahead, the mission still ended at the hull. Anti-aircraft crews opened fire as usual. Guns thundered, shells climbed. But something unfamiliar began to occur almost immediately. Explosions bloomed not on the aircraft, but around them bursts of fire suspended in empty air, close enough to touch, yet without visible contact. To seasoned gunners, the effect was disorienting. These were not hits in the traditional sense. They were near events, occurring just outside the boundaries of accepted logic. Aircraft began to come apart, mid-dive. Wings sheared away, without warning, torn loose by fragmentation that did not need to strike the fuselage directly. Control surfaces vanished in an instant, elevators and rudders shredded by explosions that erupted alongside the airframe rather than upon it. Engines flamed out or tore free. What moments earlier had been coherent machines became collapsing structures, shedding parts faster than the eye could follow. Pilots never reached the ship. Some lost control so abruptly that there was no time to react. Others attempted to hold course, only to discover that flight itself had been removed from the equation. There was no visible enemy to evade, no tracer to outrun. The aircraft simply failed, betrayed by physics rather than firepower. The sea received fragments instead of impacts. On deck, sailors watched in stunned silence as debris replaced collision. The anticipated moment, the violent certainty of impact, did not arrive. Instead, twisted metal fell harmlessly short, striking the water with muted finality. Fires did not spread. Hulls were not breached. The difference was not dramatic. It was decisive. For the gunners, understanding came slowly. They realized they were no longer trying to hit the aircraft. Their role had changed without announcement. They were not marksmen aiming at a point. They were architects of volume, shaping regions of sky that could not be entered safely. The shell no longer served the gun. The gun served the space. This shift altered perception as much as outcome. Engagements felt less frantic, less dependent on perfect timing. A shell that passed close enough was sufficient. Precision aim gave way to denial. The goal was no longer interception at a single instant, but sustained exclusion over distance. The sky itself had become layered with consequence. From the perspective of kamikaze doctrine, this was catastrophic. The attack depended on certainty, on the assumption that holding course guaranteed arrival. That assumption was now false. Commitment no longer translated into effectiveness. The closer an aircraft flew, the more dangerous the environment became. Straight-line dives, once an advantage, now amplified vulnerability. There was no adaptation in these early encounters because there could be none. Pilots did not see what destroyed them. There was no visible cue, no warning burst to react against. The explosions arrived without contact, without signal. Learning requires feedback, and feedback had been erased. After-action reports struggled to describe what had occurred. Phrases like disintegrated mid-air and destroyed without direct hit appeared repeatedly, betraying the limits of existing language. Something fundamental had shifted, but its contours were still unclear. What was clear was this: the rules governing the final seconds of attack had been rewritten. The sky no longer opened obediently for courage alone. And as more engagements followed the same pattern, it became impossible to ignore that an invisible barrier had been raised, one that no amount of resolve could simply pass through. What followed was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual convergence of evidence. Engagement after engagement revealed the same pattern, governed not by intention or belief, but by physics. Proximity detonation did not merely counter the kamikaze tactic, it inverted its logic. The very behaviors that had made the attacks effective now increased their vulnerability. Straight-line approaches, once the essence of success, became liabilities. Proximity fuses rewarded predictability. An aircraft that held a constant course presented a stable solution, allowing shells to pass close enough for automatic detonation. There was no need to anticipate evasive maneuvers. The more faithfully a pilot committed to a direct path, the easier it became for the defense to surround that path with lethal space. As aircraft closed distance, lethality increased. Proximity fuses were most effective when the relative distance between shell and target collapsed rapidly. The closer the aircraft came, the more likely a shell would detonate within destructive range. What had once been the safest phase of the attack, the final dive, became the most dangerous. Commitment no longer narrowed risk, it concentrated it. Dive speed amplified the effect. Kamikaze aircraft entered terminal descents at high velocity, converting speed into inevitability. But speed worked both ways. Fragmentation damaged scales with relative velocity. The faster an aircraft moved through a cloud of fragments, the more energy those fragments delivered. Control cables severed. Fuel lines ruptured. Structural members failed under stresses they were never designed to endure. The aircraft did not need to be struck as a whole, it only needed to be disrupted. Evasion, in theory, remained possible. A pilot could break away, widen the approach, or alter altitude. But doctrine forbade it. The moment a pilot maneuvered defensively, the mission ceased to exist. Abandoning the straight-line dive meant abandoning purpose. There was no partial success available, only impact or failure. In this new environment, Survival demanded the very behavior that doctrine denied. Thus, bravery began to shorten survival time. The most resolute pilots, those who held course most precisely, entered the densest zones of lethal probability. Their commitment made them easier to calculate, easier to bracket, easier to destroy. Courage did not confuse the defense. It clarified it. Accuracy, once the central measure of attack, became irrelevant. Proximity detonation erased the distinction between near and exact. The defense no longer needed to outshoot the attacker. It needed only to occupy the space the attacker intended to use. The shell did not chase the aircraft. It waited for it. And when distance collapsed, detonation followed automatically. In this way, the kamikaze tactic began to consume itself. Its defining features, predictability, commitment, speed fed directly into the mechanisms designed to stop it. What had been conceived as an answer to technological superiority now magnified it. Each improvement in resolve tightened the mathematics of destruction. From a distance, this reversal was almost abstract. Reports spoke of probabilities, detonation ranges, fragment dispersion, but for those in the cockpit, the experience was brutally simple. The sky no longer responded to courage. It responded to equations. And as these equations repeated themselves across the Pacific, one truth became unavoidable. A tactic built on certainty could not survive in an environment where certainty itself had been automated against it. Adaptation in war depends on one essential condition: the ability to change behavior in response to experience. For kamikaze pilots, that condition no longer existed. Doctrine did not merely discourage evasive maneuver, it forbade it outright. Once an aircraft was committed to its dive, deviation was not an option. Turning away, climbing, or breaking course meant abandoning the mission entirely. In a system built on absolutes, adjustment became indistinguishable from failure. Training reflected this rigidity. Instruction emphasized resolve rather than response, intention rather than improvisation. Pilots were taught to hold course under fire, to ignore distraction, to suppress instinct. Complex air, combat skills, defensive maneuvering, threat recognition, coordinated evasion were unnecessary within the logic of the mission. What mattered was alignment and persistence. The aircraft was not a platform for learning. It was a delivery system. Operational realities compounded the problem. Kamikaze attacks were often conducted at low altitude to reduce detection time and complicate interception. But proximity fuses thrived in exactly this environment. Lower altitude compressed space, leaving fewer avenues of escape and increasing fragment density. The closer the aircraft flew to the surface, the more confined the lethal volume became. What had once been a tactic to avoid defense now intensified exposure to it. Recognition, when it came at all, came too late. Pilots did not perceive the change in defensive effectiveness until the final seconds, if they perceived it at all. There was no visible warning, no tracer pattern to read, no shell to dodge. Detonation occurred without contact, often outside the pilot's field of vision. Control was lost instantly. There was no moment of realization to carry back. This absence of perception erased feedback loops entirely. Survivors teach the next wave. Reports shape doctrine. Experience modifies behavior. Kamikaze operations removed all three. Pilots did not survive engagements. Those who launched rarely returned. Observers on the ground saw aircraft depart and did not see them again. The cause of failure remained abstract, described only through incomplete reports and second-hand accounts. Without feedback, learning became impossible. Losses could be counted, but not interpreted. There was no clear lesson to apply, no tactical adjustment to test. Even if commanders suspected a change in defensive technology, they lacked the means to respond. Industrial limits prevented rapid countermeasures. Training pipelines were already compressed. Time no longer existed as a resource. The result was paralysis disguised as persistence. Attacks continued not because they worked, but because there was nothing else to replace them. Doctrine hardened as outcomes worsened. Resolve was reinforced where adaptation was required. Each failure confirmed belief rather than challenged it. In this way, the kamikaze tactic entered a closed system. Inputs increased, Outputs declined. Losses mounted without corresponding effect. The pilots were not outmatched by skill or courage, but by an environment that no longer responded to either. And as the gap between sacrifice and result widened, the final truth emerged quietly. A weapon that cannot learn is doomed in a war defined by change. The turning point did not arrive with a single dramatic engagement. It emerged gradually, from paperwork rather than spectacle. After-action reports accumulated across task forces, carriers, and escort groups, each describing encounters that felt familiar, yet ended differently. Kamikaze attacks still came. Aircraft still committed. But the results no longer aligned with expectation. The numbers began to drift. Hit rates declined first, quietly. Where direct impacts had once been disturbingly frequent, they now appeared sporadically. In their place were descriptions of aircraft destroyed short of the ship, often without visible contact. Reports used careful language: destroyed by near burst, disintegrated prior to impact, lost control following flak detonation. Individually, these accounts seemed anecdotal. Together, they formed a pattern. Near-miss detonations began to replace impacts as the dominant outcome. Explosions that would once have been recorded as failures now appeared in success columns. Aircraft were being eliminated not at the hull, but in the space surrounding it. The distinction mattered. A kamikaze destroyed 20 yards short of the ship was not merely a partial success, it was a complete negation of the tactic. Damage assessments reinforced the shift. Ships continued to take hits from debris and fragments, but the character of damage changed. Fires were fewer. Penetrations rarer. Structural integrity held more often than not. Crews reported shock and noise rather than catastrophic rupture. The difference between survival and security became measurable. Then the ratios inverted. Where once a small number of attacking aircraft could produce disproportionate damage, now large numbers yielded diminishing returns. Losses among attackers rose sharply while ship losses declined incrementally. The exchange rate, the cold arithmetic at the heart of naval warfare, had reversed. For the first time since the kamikaze campaign began, defense was winning decisively, not by endurance, but by prevention. Commanders took notice. Naval leadership was not immune to emotion, but it was governed by statistics. Anecdotes could be misleading. Numbers could not. Charts tracking engagement outcomes began to tell a consistent story across fleets and regions. Where proximity fuses were in use, results improved. Where they were not, vulnerabilities persisted. Correlation hardened into conclusion. Decisions followed quickly. Proximity fuses moved from selective deployment to standard issue. Distribution accelerated. Stockpiles were prioritized. Training emphasized volume coverage over precision aiming. Fire control doctrine was adjusted to reflect a new reality. The objective was no longer to hit aircraft, but to deny them the space to complete their mission. With this shift, the initiative returned to the defense. Engagements became less reactive, less desperate. The sense of inevitability that had haunted earlier attacks began to lift. Sailors still manned their stations with discipline, but the weighting changed. Impact was no longer assumed. Survival was no longer a matter of chance. For the attackers, the change was devastating. The same commitment now produced fewer results. The same courage yielded less effect. Losses mounted without corresponding damage. What had once felt unstoppable now felt futile. The imbalance was no longer moral or psychological. It was mathematical. This was the day the math became obvious not in a single moment, but in aggregate. Courage could not overcome probability when probability had been automated. Doctrine could not outpace circuitry. The kamikaze tactic had been designed to overwhelm defenses by certainty of impact. That certainty had been removed. And once removed, it could not be restored. The war did not end that day. Attacks continued. Sacrifices were still made. But the equation governing the sky had changed permanently. Defense had adapted faster than belief. What remained was to see how long an attack could persist after its logic had been disproven, and how a weapon built on resolve would respond when resolve no longer changed the outcome. There was no announcement when the change became undeniable. No communique altered doctrine. No order declared the tactic obsolete. Instead, the evidence appeared in the air itself. Kamikaze formations began to break apart before reaching their targets, not through command, but through consequence. Aircraft that once arrived intact now vanished en route, leaving gaps where certainty had once existed. The terminal dive, the defining moment of the attack, was increasingly denied. Planes disintegrated before reaching that final phase, torn apart by detonations that occurred just close enough, just often enough, to make arrival exceptional rather than expected. The sequence that doctrine relied upon no longer completed itself. Commitment no longer led to contact. The sky intervened. Escorts, once overwhelmed by sheer desperation, remained intact more often than not. Carrier screens held. Transports pressed forward without the same level of attrition. The defensive perimeter, previously porous under relentless sacrifice, began to feel sealed. The battle space tightened, not through increased aggression, but through predictability. Attacks followed familiar paths. Defense occupied them. Morale shifted quietly. There was no single moment of relief or triumph. Sailors did not cheer the absence of impact. They simply noticed that fewer alarms ended in catastrophe. Fewer ships burned. Fewer men were lost to collisions that felt unavoidable weeks earlier. Confidence returned not as bravado, but as steadiness. The waiting changed character. It was no longer fatalistic. For the pilots, the shift was more severe. They still faced death, but increasingly without effect. Missions launched with the same ceremony, the same vows, the same expectations of finality, yet outcomes no longer matched intention. Aircraft failed before purpose could be fulfilled. Sacrifice arrived early, scattered across empty air and open water. Purpose, once absolute, began to erode. The logic that had sustained the tactic, "if I reach the ship, I will matter," could no longer be trusted. When arrival was no longer assured, meaning itself became uncertain. Resolve remained, but it no longer translated into consequence. The act of dying lost its strategic clarity. This erosion was subtle, but cumulative. Attacks continued, but without the same internal coherence. The formations thinned. Timing faltered. Coordination suffered. Not because belief vanished, but because belief was no longer rewarded by results. The feedback loop that once reinforced commitment now undermined it. From the defensive perspective, the attack began to lose its shape. What had once felt like a distinct and terrifying phenomenon blurred into a series of failed approaches. The kamikaze ceased to be an existential threat and became an operational problem. Dangerous, costly, but manageable. The difference was decisive. The attack had relied on the sky opening at the final moment, yielding to courage and gravity. Now the sky remained closed. It did not resist with intention or anger. It simply existed as a hostile volume, indifferent to sacrifice. Entry no longer guaranteed arrival. Arrival no longer guaranteed effect. In this environment, the kamikaze tactic lost what had made it powerful. Not its symbolism, not its tragedy, its meaning. A weapon designed to force inevitability could not survive in a system where inevitability had been removed. The sky had not become merciful. It had become mathematical. And once that happened, the attack no longer spoke the language of war that the battlefield understood. By the spring of 1945, the pattern had hardened into routine. Japanese losses rose dramatically, not in spectacular spikes, but in relentless accumulation. Aircraft failed to return in numbers that no longer surprised commanders. Entire waves disappeared without leaving a corresponding mark on the enemy. The arithmetic of sacrifice grew increasingly lopsided, measured not in heroism, but in absence. At the same time, ship damage declined incrementally at first, then consistently. There were still hits, still fires, still casualties, but the trend line bent unmistakably downward. Fewer hulls were breached. Fewer decks were torn open by fuel and metal. The fleet advanced with growing confidence, absorbing shocks that no longer threatened its cohesion. Survival was becoming the norm rather than the exception. This imbalance strained the Japanese system beyond its limits. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours, less familiarity with their aircraft, and minimal combat experience. Training programs had already been compressed to sustain the Kamikaze campaign. Now they were hollowed out. The qualities once prized, precision flying, situational awareness, adaptability, had little place in a doctrine that demanded only alignment and resolve. Yet even those reduced demands became harder to meet. Industrial constraints compounded the problem. There were no resources to develop effective countermeasures against proximity fuses. Radar, electronics, and specialized materials lay beyond reach. Aircraft production itself struggled to keep pace with losses, let alone innovation. The tactic had been conceived as a shortcut around industrial inferiority. Instead, it collided directly with it. As losses mounted, the Kamikaze campaign entered a phase of attrition without impact. Aircraft were expended at a rate that produced diminishing strategic return. Each mission consumed irreplaceable resources, fuel, machines, lives without achieving its intended effect. The calculus that once justified extreme sacrifice now undermined it. This erosion was not sudden. It did not provoke immediate abandonment of the tactic. Instead, it hollowed it out from within. Attacks continued because there was no alternative, not because they promised results. Courage persisted, but it no longer bent outcomes. What had been framed as decisive began to feel merely costly. The phrase, "courage meets probability," captured the shift precisely. Kamikaze pilots embodied the maximum expression of human will. Proximity fuses represented the cold minimum of mathematical sufficiency. When the two met, probability prevailed, not out of malice, but out of inevitability. Equations do not tire. They do not fear. They do not respond to symbolism. For those receiving the attacks, the change was tangible. Alarm bells still rang, but fewer ended in disaster. Damage control parties acted more often in precaution than desperation. The fleet moved forward, not because danger had vanished, but because it had become predictable and predictability could be managed. For those launching them, the realization was harder to confront. Losses could be counted. Success could not. The gap between effort and effect widened with each sortie. What had once been framed as a final, righteous measure now appeared increasingly futile. The tactic was not defeated in a single battle. It burned itself out through imbalance. By late spring, the Kamikaze campaign had lost its strategic coherence. It remained deadly in isolated moments, but it no longer shaped the course of operations. The war moved on around it. Technology had not simply countered sacrifice, it had absorbed it. This was attrition without impact, a form of defeat that arrived quietly, without surrender or proclamation. And as the numbers continued to accumulate, the final lesson grew impossible to ignore. In a war defined by systems and scale, courage alone could not rewrite probability. Probability, once automated, did not negotiate. Official language did not change. Command rhetoric remained firm, resolute, defiant. Orders continued to speak of honor, duty, and decisive sacrifice. Communiqué emphasized spirit over circumstance, will over outcome. On paper, the Kamikaze remained a sacred weapon, its purpose undiminished. But paper could not conceal what the air had already revealed. Operational results told a different story. Sorties increased, yet effects diminished. Aircraft were launched, fuel consumed, pilots lost while ships continued to advance. Each mission returned fewer reports of success, more gaps filled only by silence. The distance between declared purpose and measurable outcome widened until it could no longer be bridged by language alone. For the pilots, this gap was felt before it was articulated. Departures continued with ceremony, but understanding had changed. Many now left knowing that success was unlikely not in the abstract, but statistically. The certainty that had once sustained them was gone. The final dive no longer promised consequence. It promised disappearance. This altered the nature of sacrifice itself. Death, once framed as transformative, lost its strategic clarity. A life given without effect no longer fit the logic that had justified the tactic. Courage remained, but it was no longer reinforced by results. The act persisted while its meaning eroded. Fear returned, not the fear of death, which had never fully vanished, but the fear of futility. To die and change nothing is a different burden than to die believing the outcome will matter. Without alternatives, fear had nowhere to go. It could not be managed through doctrine or redirected through training. It simply existed, unspoken, in the moments before takeoff. The sky reflected this change. What had once felt open, yielding to commitment, now felt hostile. Explosions arrived without warning. Aircraft failed without visible cause. The environment itself seemed indifferent, no longer responsive to intention or belief. The battlefield no longer recognized sacrifice as a currency. This hostility was psychological as much as physical. Pilots no longer flew toward a target with the expectation of arrival. They flew into a system that treated them as variables, not agents. The distinction mattered. In such a system, resolve did not bend outcomes. It merely increased exposure. The final gamble of the Kamikaze campaign failed quietly. There was no climactic reversal, no moment of collective realization. The tactic simply ceased to shape events. It continued at the margins, deadly in isolation, but strategically hollow. The war moved forward without adjusting to it. Command structures struggled to reconcile belief with evidence. Admitting failure would undermine the very logic that had sustained resistance. So the language persisted, even as results collapsed. This dissonance deepened the psychological toll, widening the gap between what was said and what was seen. In the end, the collapse was not one of courage, but of coherence. A weapon built on certainty cannot survive when certainty disappears. Once sacrifice no longer guarantees effect, the foundation erodes from within. The kamikaze did not end in repudiation. It ended in irrelevance. And as the final aircraft vanished into hostile air, the last lesson settled quietly into place. A tactic that depends on belief cannot endure in a battlefield governed by systems that do not believe back. The most profound change did not announce itself in fire or wreckage. It revealed itself in method. With the adoption of proximity fuses, defense no longer required precision in the traditional sense. The long-standing demand for exact timing and direct hits gave way to a different standard sufficiency. A shell did not need to strike its target. It needed only to arrive close enough, soon enough, often enough. The measure of success shifted from marksmanship to control. This shift altered the role of the human operator. Reaction time, once the critical bottleneck of air defense, became automated at the final instant. Gunners still aimed, fired, and adjusted, but the decisive moment, the choice of detonation, was removed from human hand. That decision occurred inside the shell, measured in microseconds, guided by circuitry rather than instinct. The fastest reflex could no longer compete, nor did it need to. As a result, airspace itself became the weapon. No longer a void to be crossed, it became a lethal volume to be denied. Defensive fire was no longer organized around points of interception, but around regions of exclusion. Aircraft entering those regions triggered consequences, regardless of intention or accuracy. The sky was transformed from a passive medium into an active participant in defense. Human error, always present at the margins, was sharply reduced. Fatigue, stress, miscalculation factors that had shaped outcomes for decades lost their decisive influence. The system tolerated imprecision and punished predictability. It absorbed variance and returned consistency. For the first time, defense scaled reliably with speed. This crossing marked a technological threshold. Naval warfare moved from reliance on skilled timing to reliance on embedded decision-making. The change was subtle in appearance but absolute in effect. Once weapons began to sense and act autonomously within defined limits, the relationship between attacker and defender shifted permanently. The battlefield no longer waited for human judgment to catch up. The implications extended far beyond the Pacific. Future air defense would be defined by this logic. Missiles, radar-guided systems, layered automated responses, all traced their lineage to the moment when detonation no longer depended on contact or command. The principle was established. Remove the human from the final fraction of a second, and the system becomes resilient at scale. Importantly, this was not a story of overwhelming force. Proximity fuses did not make defenses invulnerable. They made them consistent. They replaced moments of brilliance and failure with probabilities that could be trusted. In doing so, they reshaped how wars would be fought not through singular acts of courage or precision, but through systems that functioned regardless of them. Invisible systems now governed outcomes. There was nothing for pilots to see, nothing to react against. No sound, no signal, no warning, only consequence. The absence of spectacle was the point. The most important decisions were made beyond perception, inside mechanisms too small and too fast to acknowledge intent. In this environment, belief lost its leverage. Resolve no longer bent the battlefield. Commitment no longer guaranteed effect. The rules had changed, not because one side fought harder, but because one side learned to let machines decide the final moment. This was what proximity fuses really changed, not merely the fate of kamikaze attacks, but the grammar of modern defense. The battlefield became a space governed by thresholds rather than courage, by systems rather than symbols. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no return. Years later, sailors would struggle to describe what had changed, only that it had. They remembered explosions without collisions, bursts of violence suspended in the air, detached from the brutal certainty of impact. Alarms still sounded, guns still fired. But the moment everyone once waited for, the shattering collision of aircraft and ship, often never came. Aircraft vanished mid-air. Not dramatically, not always visibly. Sometimes they simply failed to arrive. A dot on radar disappeared. A shape in the sky came apart too far away to threaten steel. The sequence ended early, interrupted by forces that did not announce themselves. The attack dissolved before it could complete its meaning. The sea bore witness in a new way, where once it absorbed fireballs and burning wreckage slammed against hulls, it now received fragments, scattered metal, torn fabric, pieces of engines that never fulfilled their purpose. The water closed over them quietly. There was no secondary explosion, no shockwave rolling across the deck, just absence where inevitability had once been. For those who had manned the guns, the memory carried a strange weight. They had not outdueled an enemy pilot. They had not reacted faster or aimed better in the final second. They had participated in something less visible, less personal. They had filled the sky with conditions rather than shots. The result felt detached from effort, yet undeniably real. This was where courage met mathematics. Not as opposites, but as incompatible languages. Courage speaks in absolutes advance. Commit, hold course. Mathematics speaks in thresholds, probabilities, tolerances. One demands meaning. The other produces outcome. When they met, outcome prevailed without commentary. Commitment met circuitry. A human decision, absolute and final, collided with a mechanism that did not recognize intention. The shell did not know why the aircraft approached. It did not weigh sacrifice or belief. It responded only to distance, signal, and threshold. In doing so, it rendered motive irrelevant. The kamikaze attack had been built on the idea that impact was the final arbiter that arrival equaled effect. Proximity fuses broke that chain. They introduced consequence before arrival, resolution before contact. The attack died not at the hull, but in the space before it. Not because it lacked courage, but because courage was no longer the deciding factor. This was not a triumph to celebrate. It was a transformation to acknowledge. The technology did not erase tragedy. It redistributed it. Loss still occurred. Lives were still spent. But the terms of exchange changed irrevocably. Sacrifice no longer guaranteed significance. Death no longer commanded attention by default. In that sense, the end of the kamikaze campaign was not marked by silence, but by subtraction. Fewer impacts, fewer fires, fewer names added to ship logs. The war continued, shaped increasingly by systems that did not pause to interpret intent. The final irony lay in the willingness to die. The pilots had offered everything: certainty, commitment, life itself to ensure impact. They were prepared to make the ultimate collision unavoidable. But the battlefield they faced had evolved beyond collision as a requirement. They were willing to die on impact. The shell decided impact was no longer necessary.